One of the great things about the NFL is that you can play it at any height and at any size and be an excellent player. And in today's video, I go over the best players of all time at every single height that has played in the NFL. First things first, I am only going to be doing in the Super Bowl era because I'm not too confident in the height measurements before that. Yes, there's Jack Shapiro and a few others who played at 5'1" or 5'3", who were technically the smallest players in NFL history. However, there just aren't any pictures, and I'm just not too confident in the measurements that they took in 1929. So in order to make this list as accurate as possible, I started in the Super Bowl era. Before I get into the players, I do think it's important just to put out there the average heights of people across the world. It does vary on the country, but the average male height goes anywhere from 5'5" tall in India to 6 foot tall in Denmark. But of course, as most of us are from the United States, I'll go with that. And the average height is 5'9.5" tall. And you might be surprised how many of the best NFL players ever are below the average height in the United States. Starting off, we have Reggie Smith at 5'4" tall, 168 pounds.
Way to go, dude. I can't believe you pulled it off.
At 5'4" tall, he is the shortest player in the Super Bowl era, and he was a very fast player. However, due to his small stature, all that he was a kick returner for a few years, and unfortunately, he never scored a touchdown. Up next, at 5'5" tall, is Trendon Holiday. He was 162 pounds. Once again, a really fast player, and he played from 2011 to 2014. He did catch a few passes. However, once again, his main role was punt returner, kick returner. He did have 2 punt return touchdowns and 2 kick return touchdowns in his career. Then at 5'6", this is where you find some real deal NFL All-Stars, and of course, this one is Darren Sproles, 5'6", 190 pounds when he entered the NFL. He did gain a little bit of muscle mass later on in his career, so he was a little heavier. But to start off, 5'6", 190 pounds, and he was an all-around player, one of my favorites from a few years ago as an Eagles fan, but he was great with the Chargers, great with the Eagles, great with the Saints. I know that was out of order, but oh well. He was a true all-purpose back who could catch, run, and return kicks and punts. He averaged 4.9 yards per attempt rushing the ball, and he ended up with 3,500 rushing yards and 4,800 receiving yards. Darren Sproles is even in the All-2010s team, just to show how great of a player he was. At 5'7", once again, we have another great running back. This is Maurice Jones-Drew. He is, in my opinion, the best Jacksonville Jaguar player ever. He was a 3-time Pro Bowler, 1-time All-Pro. He even led the NFL in rushing for a season. He was just a really great running back in the late 2000s. He had about 8,000 rushing yards and 68 touchdowns. At 5'8", this is where we get to the real all-time greats. And once again, it is a running back. It is Barry Sanders at 5'8", 203 pounds.
Boy, that escalated quickly.
So he was fast, and he was big and strong. He just wasn't tall. But he is often seen as one of the best running backs in NFL history. He was on the Lions, unfortunately for him, because his career wasn't that long and he really didn't have any playoff success. But he played from 1989 to 1998. Every single season, he was in the Pro Bowl. That is insane. He was in the 1990s All-NFL team, and of course is in the Hall of Fame. Throughout his career, he compiled over 15,000 rushing yards and averaged 5 yards per attempt, which is elite. If you don't know, in the NFL, if you're over about 4.1, 4.2 yards per attempt, that was good. So 5 is insane, especially since the defense only worried about Barry Sanders on this team. At 5'9", we are continuing the streak of all-time running backs, because it does seem if you're 5'10" or shorter and you're in the NFL, you could potentially be one of the best running backs ever. And at 5'9" is Emmit Smith. So he's best known for his time with the Cowboys, of course. He won the Super Bowl MVP. He was an 8-time Pro Bowler, 4-time All-Pro, and of course is in the Hall of Fame. He also has the distinction of having the most rushing yards ever, and honestly, this is a record that will never be broken. He had 18,355 rushing yards, and I would just be shocked if anybody ever could beat that, because no one runs in the NFL anymore, people break down, and he played for a long time, and he played well for a long time. Even in 2004, when he was 35 years old, he had 937 rushing yards. And 5'9" is where I finally started to get some real tough choices to make, because before this, 5'8" and shorter, it was clear who the best player was. It was really no question. But at 5'9", I started to have to make some actual decisions. Now, I will say Emmitt Smith is definitely better than these others, but for example, Steve Smith Sr. or Wes Welker were two excellent wide receivers, so of course I at least had to consider them, and before this, there was no question. At 5'10", this was another really tough decision, but to continue the streak of running backs, I have Walter Payton, who many see as the best running back of all time. He has the second most yards through his career, just behind Emmitt Smith. He averaged 4.4 yards per carry, 9 Pro Bowls, 5 All-Pros, in the Hall of Fame. He's on the All-1970s team and the All-1980s team. And he even had a cool nickname in Sweetness. So it would be really hard to leave him off this list, so that's why he's on there. But 5'10" is a good height for players, not just running backs too. There were some other greats such as LaDainian Tomlinson, who I strongly considered putting on this list, but chose not to. There was also Marshall Faulk and Antonio Brown, who is one of the best receivers ever. So 5'10", you can be several different positions and be excellent, but with the responsibility of picking the best player at each height, I had to go with Walter Payton. At 5'11", we finally get to the defensive side of the ball, and this is one of the best defensive backs ever, and that is Ed Reed. So he's 5'11", 205 pounds, often seen as one of the smartest NFL players ever. He was a 9-time Pro Bowler, 5-time All-Pro, and he was on the All-2000s team. Of course, is also in the Hall of Fame. He had 64 interceptions in his career, and he was one of the captains on the great Baltimore defenses throughout the 2000s. 5'11" was the first time I had to even consider a quarterback, with Russell Wilson being 5'11". However, largely due to how much he's fallen off in recent years, I can't put him in over Ed Reed, one of the best safeties ever. Then at 6 foot, we finally get to an NFL player that is taller than the average height in every country around the world. Once again, I went with a defensive back, and I went with one of the best corners ever, and that is Rod Woodson. He had 71 interceptions, was an 11-time Pro Bowler and a 6-time All-Pro, and is by almost everybody considered a top 2 or 3 corner in the history of the NFL. And he spent most of his career with the Pittsburgh Steelers, of course a storied franchise, especially on the defensive side of the ball. Some of the runners-up at 6 foot tall were the great Drew Brees, Brian Dawkins, great safety for the Eagles, Marvin Harrison, of course, a great wide receiver, and Champ Bailey, another great defensive back. At 6'1", I have Aaron Donald. Of course, he just retired, but he was one of the most dominant defensive tackles in the history of the NFL. Coming out of college, he was known for being small, a little short, but he overcame that with just pure aggression and strength, and had to be double teamed at all time. And he was definitely one of the best players in the 2010s. He's 10-time Pro Bowler, 8-time All-Pro. He won the Defensive Player of the Year multiple times, of course, is on the All-2010s team. He was just an excellent player, and he had 111 sacks throughout his career, and that's with being double teamed almost all of the time. There were some other greats such as Ray Lewis that I had to choose Aaron Donald over. Tough choice, but I just think Aaron was a more dominant player. At 6'2", this is potentially the best height in the NFL to be a player. It's a huge logjam of talent, but I had to go with Jerry Rice, the Wayne Gretzky of the NFL. He holds some NFL wide receiver stats that will just never be broken. He has 22,000 receiving yards and almost 200 touchdowns. He was a 13-time Pro Bowler and a 10-time All-Pro. He is, without a doubt, the best wide receiver ever, and there aren't many positions where you can just say, hey, that's the best ever, and have no argument. He is one of the 3 or 4 best players in the history of the NFL, so of course, he has to make it at 6'2". This does leave off several all-time greats that in a few years I might have to adjust this, but probably not, because Jerry Rice is just that good. It leaves off players such as Patrick Mahomes, Aaron Rodgers, Brett Favre, Steve Young, and Joe Montana. This is the height to be a quarterback, and I really thought I was going to pick a quarterback. However, Jerry Rice was just that good. If you made it this far into the video, please consider liking, subscribing, and commenting down below about how you agree with all of my picks. But back to the video. At 6'3", back to the defensive side of the ball with a player who Bill Belichick calls one of the best players in the history of the NFL, and that is LT, not LaDainian Tomlinson, but Lawrence Taylor. He had 142 sacks in 184 games, so almost a sack every single game. He was a 10-time Pro Bowler, 8-time All-Pro, and is seen as one of the 2 or 3 best defensive players in the history of the NFL, and he was a 3-time Defensive Player of the Year. Honestly, with Lawrence Taylor, I just saw he was 6'3" and didn't really consider anyone else from there on, but there were some other all-time greats at 6'3", such as John Elway, but they're not LT. At 6'4", we have the player who everyone was waiting on. It is Tom Brady. He is, without a question, the best player of all time. He has won 7 Super Bowls, more than any franchise, and he even has 5 Super Bowl MVPs. Tom Brady has 89,000 passing yards. He was a 15-time Pro Bowler. Somehow he was only a 3-time All-Pro, but with 7 Super Bowls, I'll forgive that. He arguably has 3 separate careers inside of his career that could be Hall of Fame careers. He's just that good. He played until he was like 54 years old, and he was even good then. Without any discussion at all, Tom Brady, best player ever at 6'4". But asking for who's second place at that height, we have some greats such as Dan Marino or Randy Moss. At 6'5", we have who is another one of the best defensive players of all time, and that is Reggie White, who was 6'5", 291 pounds. He spent almost all of his career with the Eagles or the Green Bay Packers, had 198 sacks and 33 forced fumbles, and if you go back and watch his film, it is just extremely dominant. Him and LT are by most seen as the 2 best defensive players of all time. And he's making it on the list at 6'5", over some great quarterbacks such as Big Ben, Carson Palmer, Peyton Manning, Phillip Rivers, or some other greats at tight end such as Tony Gonzalez, who was an amazing player at the tight end position. At 6'6", we have the best tight end in NFL history, in my opinion, and that is Rob Gronkowski. Well, he's not going to have a lot of the stats for playing for a long time because he just kept on getting hurt. I mean, he's 35 and has been retired for over a year at this point. But in his prime, he was one of the best players I've ever seen. Maybe the best receiver that I personally have seen in my life. Now, I did miss out on Jerry Rice, of course, but Gronkowski was unstoppable for 5 or 6 years, and the only way they could get him was by essentially hurting him by taking his knees out. He was big, fast, could catch, could run great routes, he could block very well at 6'6", 265 pounds. I don't think there's a lot of argument. He's just one of the best ever. This does leave off some all-time great linemen, such as Joe Thomas, but for the best tight end ever, I think it's reasonable. At 6'7", this is when we get into the lineman section, finally, and I have Orlando Pace.
Oh, it's on, big boy!
Who is a Hall of Fame tackle who played most of his career with the Rams. He had 7 Pro Bowls, 3 All-Pros, and he is seen as one of the top 10 offensive linemen in NFL history. At 6'8", this is where we're starting to get some slim pickings because most people 6'8" go to the NBA instead of the NFL, but I have Calais Campbell. He has had 105 sacks. He's a defensive end, and he's been solid for his entire career. He is a 6-time Pro Bowler, only 1-time All-Pro. He is on the All-2010s team. He's just a great player, and at 6'8", in my opinion, the best ever. At 6'9", getting to the end here if you've made it this far, but we have another lineman at Jonathan Ogden. He played for the Baltimore Ravens and is seen as one of the top 5 linemen ever. He was an 11-time Pro Bowler, 4-time All-Pro, of course, is in the Hall of Fame, and I don't really know how much I can say about him because he's a lineman, but quite simply, he was seen as one of the best ever. At 6'10", we have very slim pickings, but I have Morris Stroud, who was a tight end for the Kansas City Chiefs. So he played in the 1970s. He actually didn't catch the ball that much because, well, they didn't throw it to tight ends that much. Or they didn't throw it to anybody that much, but especially tight ends. He only caught 50 passes, but he averaged about 18 yards per reception, so that's good enough for me at 6'10", especially since there's not very many options. Then at 6'11", there is nobody. There just hasn't been anyone at 6'11". But at 7 foot, there was defensive tackle Richard Sly for the Oakland Raiders, the tallest player in NFL history, and he only played in 8 games, didn't really do much. But I thought I'd mention him just to cover all of my bases. So there you have it. There is the complete history of Super Bowl era players at each height. Who's the best? Who's the worst? Well, I didn't cover who's the worst because that would be hard to do. But you have all the best players at each height. Please leave a comment down below. Tell me which pick of mine is your favorite. Maybe, I guess, if you disagree with one, that's okay too. But like, subscribe, and I will see you later.